State your name for the record, please.
Faith Warren.
And spell your last name for the record.
Warren.
State your address for the record, please.
2041 First Avenue, Apartment 11, New York, New York.
Thank you. First two questions are on the record.
Thank you. Good morning, Ms. Warren.
Good morning.
My name is Anthony Giuliano, and the law firm that I work for represents Lauren Brickner McDonald in a lawsuit that's been brought against United Airlines. We are here today to take your deposition. Do you understand that?
Yes.
Okay. Prior to now, have you ever had a deposition taken before?
No.
Okay. Without going into details of the conversation, have you had the opportunity to speak with your counsel about the deposition?
Yes.
Okay. I will go through a couple of very basic ground rules. That way we're both on the same page with regard to how the procedure works, okay?
Okay.
I'm going to be asking you questions that I think are relevant to the lawsuit. You will be providing me answers to the best of your ability. You've been placed under oath. Do you understand that?
Yes.
Okay. That oath does require you to tell the truth. Do you understand that?
Yes.
Although we are in a comfortable conference room here today, your sworn deposition testimony may be used at some point in this case as the trial court or as the trial judge or pre-trial judge permits it. Do you understand that?
Yes.
Excuse me. If you don't know the answer to a question that I asked, it's fine. Just tell me that you don't know. We are going to be talking about some things that happened some time ago, so I don't know is a perfectly acceptable answer as long as it's the truth. We don't want you to guess at any answers. You can, however, estimate or approximate answers to my questions if that's something that you're able to do. Do you understand that?
Yes.
Okay. Your attorney may object to some questions that are asked. If you do hear an objection, just kind of hold your answer and wait for further instructions from your counsel, okay?
Okay.
You've been doing a good job so far. Just try to keep your answers verbal rather than like shakes and nods. That way the court reporter
Okay.
can write down everything that you say and that there's no confusion in the transcript, okay?
Sure.
And the last thing is, even though we're sort of having a conversation and you can anticipate where a lot of my questions are going to be going, just wait for me to finish the question before you provide your answer again. That way the transcript is as clear as it can be, okay? All right. Thank you for your address. Are you currently employed?
Yes.
By whom?
I'm a nanny, so a family.
Okay. How long have you been doing that?
Since May.
Of this year?
Yes.
Okay. And prior to that, were you employed by anyone else?
No.
At any point were you employed by United Airlines?
Yes. Well, yeah, done before.
When was that?
I worked for United from August 31st, 2015 to March 26th, 2018.
And during that period of time, what position or positions did you hold with United?
Just flight attendant.
Okay. Other than United, have you been employed as a flight attendant for any other airline?
No.
The accident that we're here to discuss today happened in June of 2016. So based on your prior answer, you were employed with United as a flight attendant at that time, correct?
Yes.
Prior to actually working on flights as a flight attendant, was there any training involved?
Yes.
Tell me about that.
I spent 5 weeks in Houston, and we learned all manner of safety, evacuating planes, customer service, drills, commands. Yeah.
Okay. As part of that training, were you given any documents?
Yes.
What types of documents?
Can you explain what you mean by that?
Yeah, I mean, as a part of that training, you said you were there for about 5 weeks. Did the company provide you with any handbooks or manuals or any kind of documents with respect
Yes,
to the
we
training?
had a paper manual at the time.
Okay. And that was provided by United?
Yes.
Is that something you got to keep after the training was finished?
Yes, when we began training, that was our manual until we left the company.
Okay. And you had access to that manual during the time that you were employed by the company?
Yes, it comes on every flight.
Okay. When you leave the company, do you keep the manual or do you give it back?
So we switched from a paper to an electronic manual in 2016, and you do give the electronic one back after you leave.
Okay. How do you get an electronic manual?
They have an agreement with Apple that we had iPhone. I think there were 6 Pluses at the time, and they totally reboot and re-hardware them, and then it's like a united device, and it has our FAOM manual, which is all of our like safety procedures, and then customer service policies and our sales app, and all of those things are all on one device.
Okay, so it doesn't go onto a phone that you already have, it's a separate device that United
It's a
gives you?
separate device that United owns.
Okay, and then you give it back at the end of your employment?
Yes.
Okay. When the switch happened from paper to electronic, did you have to give the paper manual back or did you get to keep that?
You didn't have to, but they changed so much with the updates and stuff that a paper manual from even 6 months ago is
Okay.
pretty useless.
Other than that 5-week training, throughout the course of your employment with United, were there any other training sessions that you were involved in?
We go to requalification. It's called CQ, continued qualification, every year.
And is it the same time every year, or is it based on the date of your hire or something else?
It's based on the date of your hire.
Okay. And how long is that yearly requalification?
It's 2 days.
I know you said it was in 2016 that the paper manuals changed to electronic. Do you remember when in 2016 that would have been?
No, I don't remember.
Okay. Can you approximate whether it was the first half of the year as opposed to the second?
I believe it was probably the second half of the year, but I couldn't confirm. It was a slow transfer. So we had both, like we had the electronic and the paper manual for a while because the FAA had to make sure that we all knew how to use the electronic one before we were allowed to just have the electronic one.
Okay. And earlier you said that you have that manual on every flight with you. Is that a United requirement?
Yes, it's a requirement.
Other than what you've already told me, were you involved in any other training for any reason with United?
No. Well, I guess every so often they will send out like a thing that we have to complete online, but it doesn't usually have anything to do with safety stuff. It's
Okay.
service updates, or I think when all of the mass shootings started, they had us do some training like that one.
Okay. You did mention safety as being one of the topics or areas that were covered in that initial 5-week training.
Yes.
Can you tell me specifically what types of safety issues?
All of them. I mean, we go through the entire manual. That's our training. So you start with fighting fires, evacuating planes on land and in water, hijackings. I mean, it's the entire manual procedures that you go through. It's hard for me to remember
Okay.
exactly specifics of what they focus on, but all of it. And then health-related stuff, like, you know, if there's a medical emergency on board. And
Any training with regard to, or strike that, are there any procedures in place that you recall related to carry-on baggage?
No, because that's not something that we do. The only training that we have when it comes to overhead bins is to make sure that they're closed and latched
Okay.
for takeoff and landing.
There are regulations, I assume, about where bags can and cannot be placed, right? Carry-on bags?
Yes.
And what do you recall about that?
Well, bags have to be stowed. So bags go in the overhead bin, and if they're small enough, we ask people to place them underneath the seat in front of them.
A moment ago you said something to the effect, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but something to the effect that we're not involved in that when I asked you about carry-on bags. Did you mean we're not involved with actually storing and removing bags?
Yes.
Is that a United policy?
Yes. It's I don't know if that's like the right term for it, I suppose, but we are not. United doesn't want to be liable for any injuries that we might receive when lifting bags if they're heavy or taking them down. So it's if we decide to help like a disabled passenger with a bag, then it's at our own risk. So
Okay.
we don't handle overhead.
During the time that you were employed for United and acting as a flight attendant on United flights, was there ever a time where you would assist a passenger in either putting up an overhead bag into a bin or taking it out?
I helped a couple pregnant women with bags, but even then I'm small myself. So when there's somebody that needs help, I usually suggest or will help them find a passenger that looks bigger and stronger than me. I only lift bags if they're like a tote bag.
Is there typically a number of flight attendants on any given flight?
Well, we have FAA minimums that have to be on board, and then occasionally we'll be staffed over the minimum. So it's different for each configuration of a plane, how many flight attendants are required to be on board.
And how did United determine whether a flight would have the FAA minimum number of flight attendants or more?
With scheduling, the schedulers do it.
Okay. Do you still have your written manual from United?
Yes.
Okay. I'm going to make a request to council that the manual be provided. I'll follow up with a letter to council and you can communicate with her about that, okay?
Yeah, I don't know if that's allowed because if there's a lot of secure
Okay.
safety
You could-
information. Yeah.
Whatever issues you may have, deal with your council.
Yeah, just put it in writing and I'll respond.
Yep. The electronic version of the manual, after the switch, do you know whether it was possible to print any of those materials?
I don't know.
Never tried?
No.
Council, I'm going to make the same request about the updated or the current electronic manual, and I'll follow that up with a letter to you, and we can take it from there, okay?
Yeah, that's fine, but when you say current, I mean, that might not be applicable during the accident.
That makes sense. We'll refine the request to the manual that was in effect at the time of the incident, June of 2016, and I'll again follow that up with a letter to you, okay?
Okay, and I'll respond.
Yep. Okay. Again, this incident was on June 15, I believe, 2016. Do you recall the incident that has led to this lawsuit?
Mostly.
Okay.
But, I mean, it's years ago.
I understand. It was was a flight from Denver to Newark, is that correct?
Yes.
Earlier you were talking about sometimes there's the FAA minimum number of flight attendants on a flight and sometimes there are more. Do you know whether this particular flight had the minimum or if there were more?
We had our minimum of 3 and we had 1 deadheading crew member.
Okay, what do you mean by deadhead?
It means they're not currently working the flight, but they're being paid by United to transfer them from one hub to another. So they're on the list of crew members, but they weren't working.
Okay. In addition to yourself, do you recall the names of the other 2 flight attendants on that flight?
Claire and Brandon.
Okay. Would that be Claire Burkett?
Sure.
If you're not
I
sure,
think
that's
she.
okay.
I think she's gotten married. So.
Okay. At the time, do you know if her name was Claire Burkett?
No, I don't remember.
Okay. And Brandon Collop, do you know if that was Brandon's last name?
Yes.
Okay. You're no longer with the company. Do you know whether Claire is still with the company?
I don't know.
Do you know whether Brandon is still with the company?
Brandon is,
How do you know that?
because he told me.
Okay. When was that?
This morning when we saw him.
Okay. Prior to this morning, when's the last time you spoke with Brandon?
That flight that we worked together.
On this flight?
Yes.
Okay. And the reason for speaking to him this morning was?
To say hi and to prepare
Okay, was this a telephone conversation or in person?
in person.
Okay, was your attorney also present?
Yes.
Okay, then I'll not ask about any conversations that you guys had in the presence of your counsel. Have you spoken to Brandon at any time outside the presence of the United Counsel for this case, since the time of the flight?
When we were waiting in the office.
Okay, and the attorney was not present at that time?
Right.
Okay, did you talk about anything with respect to this lawsuit during that part of the conversation?
No.
Okay.
Not specifics about it.
Prior to the flight taking off in Denver, were you involved in any handling of carry-on bags?
Not that I remember, no.
Okay. And I know you said typically you don't, once in a while you would help out, but specifically to this flight you don't recall one way or the other?
No, I don't recall doing it.
Okay. Do you recall if this was a full flight?
I'm sure it probably was, but I don't have much memory of if every seat was filled.
Okay. I know sometimes when flights are full or crowded, there'll be announcements requesting that people check their bags as opposed to carrying them on. Is that
Yes.
right?
Yes.
Do you know whether that happened for this particular flight?
No, I don't know, because that happens out at the gate where we are not.
Okay, so you're not involved in that, whether or not it happened?
No.
For this particular flight, are you aware whether or not any of the other flight attendants assisted any passengers with their carry-on bags prior to departure?
Not that I'm aware
Didn't see any other flight attendants packing any overhead bins for this flight?
of. I don't remember seeing it, but like I said, it was 2 years ago.
You just don't know one or the other?
I don't remember seeing it.
Okay.
I don't see everything that happens during boarding.
Okay, that's fine. I just want to make sure I
Yeah.
understand your testimony. So I think what you're saying is you don't remember seeing it happen. It may have happened. You're just not sure one way or the other.
Yes.
Okay. Are you aware of any conversations between any of the flight attendants and the passengers related to packing the overhead bins on that flight prior to departure?
Not that I remember.
The passenger who was the plaintiff in this lawsuit was seated in room 25. I believe her seat was 25C. So focusing your attention to that area of the plane, are you aware of whether any flight attendant was working in the overhead compartment or the overhead bin for any reason prior to this flight taking off?
I don't remember. We all closed bins, but I could not tell you who did what on that flight.
Okay. Do you have a recollection of whether that flight whether or not the overhead bins were at capacity?
No. If it was a full flight, then I assume that the overhead bins were pretty full, but I don't have a direct memory of this flight.
That's fine. How about the flight itself? Any recollection of what type of flight it was, meaning smooth, turbulent, somewhere in between?
I don't remember.
Are there any records that tell you in-flight information, such as whether or not there was turbulence or whether or not the seatbelt sign was on or off or anything like that?
Not for us. I don't know if anybody else has that information, but not for us.
Okay. Not something that the flight attendants get?
No.
Are you required to put in any sort of information, either during or after a flight, related to whether the flight was smooth versus turbulent, or whether or not the seatbelt signs were on or off, or during any period of time?
No.
Okay. Do you know whether anyone else is supposed to do that?
I have no idea if pilots do that or not.
Okay. While this flight was in the air after takeoff prior to landing, were you aware of any flight attendant or other person moving any bags in the overhead bins in or around row 25?
No, that I remember.
Okay. Similar to what you said before, you don't recall seeing it happen, it may have happened, you're just not sure. Is that fair?
Yes.
When this flight landed, where were you on the plane?
In my jump seat at the back of the plane.
Okay. Where was Claire?
Next to me.
And where was Brandon?
In his jump seat at the front of the plane.
During the course of the flight, there were announcements made by the flight attendants, is that correct?
Yes.
And is there a policy about who makes which announcement?
The purser is the one required to make the announcements.
And what's a purser?
The purser is the lead flight attendant.
Okay, and who was that on this flight?
Brandon.
And the other two flight attendants, do they have a title other than purser?
No.
Other than, I'm sorry, strike that. So the purser makes all of the in-flight announcements with respect to the flight attendant announcements?
Yes.
Are there records kept whether or not the flight attendant announcements are made as opposed to not made during any particular flight?
Not a written record, no.
Okay, but it is a policy to make certain announcements by the flight attendants during each flight, is that correct?
Yes.
Any reason to believe that those announcements were not made on this particular flight?
No, if the purser doesn't make them, then somebody will call and remind them.
Okay.
And it tells us what to do too. Certain announcements are like our cue to do certain things.
Okay. What announcements, if you know, well, let me go back a second. Have you ever been a purser?
Yes.
Okay. Are you familiar with what announcements the purser is required to make during the course of a flight?
Yes.
Okay. How about before the flight takes off? There are also announcements made, correct?
Yes.
Do any of the pre-flight announcements have to do with carry-on bags?
Yes.
And how many pre-flight announcements deal with carry-on bags?
2 separate announcements, but they are repeated throughout the boarding process.
Okay. And how about during the flight? Announcements with respect to carry-on bags?
During the flight, there are no announcements specifically about carry-on bags.
Okay, and how about after the flight lands?
There are announcements about overhead bins and bags to be careful when opening because items may have shifted during flight.
I've heard that so many times in my life. I think everybody has, right?
We could probably all repeat that.
Yeah. Okay. The 2 separate announcements prior to the flight taking off, what are those announcements?
The boarding announcement is, the welcome aboard announcement, and as you make your way to your seat, please make sure you place your large carry-on items into the overhead bin. Any smaller items can be placed underneath the seat in front of you. Rollerboard bags tend to fit best wheels first, and then some flight attendants will get more specific if they feel like they want to, or if you're seeing passengers place bags in that shouldn't go up there.
Okay, and that you said was repeated various times. Is that determined by the flight attendant?
We're required to make it numerous times.
Okay, any specific number of times?
No, but I believe it's like every certain amount of minutes or something like that, but I don't remember exactly.
Okay, that's fine. And you said, I think, that there were 2 separate announcements regarding carry-ons prior to takeoff. What's the other one?
There's the door closure announcement, and that's usually right before the door closes to the plane, and it's just reminding everybody to make sure everything is stowed and in its proper place before takeoff.
Okay. And then you said when the flight lands, there's that announcement about, things may have shifted.
Yes.
When is that made?
It's usually during taxi from landing to the gate.
Okay. And again, it's your understanding that all of these announcements would have been made on this particular flight?
Yes.
But you just don't have an independent recollection one way or the other. Is that correct?
No, but I'm certain that they were made. It would have been bizarre, and I would have called if
Okay.
those announcements were
That's
made.
fine. So they're typically announcements that are always made?
Yes.
You have no reason to believe they were not made on this particular flight?
Right.
Okay. Now, you said when the flight lands, each of you are in your jump seats, 2 in the back on this flight, 1 in the front. When are you either required or permitted to get out of the jump seat after landing?
We get up at the same time that passengers do with the seatbelt sign going off, but that's when we're disarming all of the doors to the aircraft. It's our first duty. As soon as the seatbelt sign goes off, you disarm your doors.
Does the purser always sit in the front jump seat?
Yes.
Okay. And is it the purser who has the obligation to open the door?
The gate agent opens the door of the plane.
Okay. So, what's the purser doing from the time he gets up until the time the gate agent opens the door?
Gets up, disarms both of the doors in the front of the plane, and then the gate agent and customer service agent is usually right there, so you're watching through the window waiting for them to knock on the door, so you can give them a thumbs up that they can open the door.
Okay, when you say disarm, do you mean unlock?
So it's when the slides are engaged, like the emergency slides, when you arm the door, that's making sure that they're engaged. So if you were to open the door while the door is armed, the slides will open and everybody can get out of the plane. Disarming them is making sure that when you open the door of the plane, they don't inflate, because that would
Okay.
hurt the gate agent.
That's for sure.
And cost the airline lots of money.
Okay. And the flight attendants in the rear of the plane, when they are permitted to get up with the other passengers, what are their responsibilities at that time?
We immediately disarm our doors and then we're kind of just standing in the back of the plane, waiting for everybody to go.
Okay. Are there any procedures, I'll strike that, are there any policies, I guess is a better word, with respect to assisting passengers with their carry-ons as the flight is deplaning?
No.
Okay. In your experience, would you typically help any passengers take their bags out from overhead bins after the plane has landed and gotten to the gate?
No.
Have you ever done that as far as you can remember?
No.
Have you ever noticed any other flight attendant on any flight that you've worked on assist a passenger with a bag in the overhead bin after the plane has landed?
No.
Is there a policy that says flight attendants are not permitted to do that?
It's the same policy of, it's our risk, but it's pretty impossible to get into the aisles during deplaning, so we don't, and other passengers tend to help each other during deplaning more than they do during boarding.
Okay. Earlier I asked you about whether or not you recall seeing any flight attendants assisting with passenger bags. Again, back to when the plane was boarding, do you recall seeing any passengers in or around row 25 putting bags into the overhead?
I don't remember.
Okay. Based on your prior answer, I assume you did not see any flight attendant take any bag out of any overhead compartment during this particular flight after it landed. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. Do you recall seeing any, a better question, do you have a specific recollection of seeing any passenger take a bag out of an overhead bin on this particular flight?
No, but it's hard to see that kind of stuff from the back of the plane when everybody's standing in the aisles, so.
Okay. It's your understanding that there was an incident on this flight after it landed, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Tell me what you know about it.
During deplaning, a call light went off, and Claire and I, a lot of times people hit them accidentally, so we were trying to see if we could see where it was coming from, and almost immediately we got a call from the purser that said that somebody had been injured, and so we made our way up to the row that the call light was in, and people were deplaning during that time. We asked her what happened, and I was told that a passenger pulling his bag out of the overhead bin hit her with his bag. And I asked where he was, or if he was still on the plane, so that I could ask him what happened, but they said that he was already gone. And then we asked her, like how she was feeling, like what we could do if she wanted us to call paramedics. She asked for us to call paramedics, and we moved, after the flight, we asked her to sit down, and after the flight cleared a little bit, we moved her to first class. We sat with her until medics came. She asked for ice, but we had already dumped all the ice, which is procedure. And medics came shortly after. We told her they would have everything that she would need when it came to that, and then the medic came on board, and I don't know exactly what they did with her, but then they asked her if she wanted an ambulance, and she said no, and then she asked for a wheelchair off the plane, so the customer service brought down a wheelchair, and they took her off the plane.
Okay, thank you for that. From the time that you got the call, or let me ask that question. Did you actually take the call, or did Claire take the call about the injured passenger?
I don't remember.
Okay. And you said it was the purser that made the call, so I assume that's Brandon?
Yes.
From the time that either you or Claire took that call, until the time that the passenger was taken off the plane in a wheelchair, how long a period of time?
I would approximate like 20 minutes, but I don't remember very well the time. That's my guess with the typical deplaning, but they were quick with the medics coming. I would remember if it was long, because that means I had to stay without getting paid.
Okay. Was there any conversation between you and the injured passenger regarding whether or not a flight attendant had packed the overhead bin over her head at that time?
No.
After learning about the incident, did you discuss with either Claire or Brandon whether either of them had assisted in packing the overhead bin above the injured passenger's row?
No.
I know in one of your prior answers a couple moments ago, you told me about some conversation that you had with the injured passenger, correct?
Yes.
Is there anything else that you spoke with her about that you have not already told me?
Not that I remember.
Okay. Were you present while the injured passenger was having conversations with either Claire or Brandon?
Yes, we were all there pretty much the whole time, I believe. Yeah, sitting there with her. I mean, I don't think I was ever not with her until the paramedics took her off.
Okay. During that period of time, were there conversations going on between the injured passenger and either Brandon or Claire?
Only about what happened, but nothing else. We were all a part of the conversation, I believe, from what I remember.
Other than what you already told me, did you hear any conversation between either Brandon or Claire and the injured passenger about whether or not anyone had packed the bag over her head?
No.
Have you ever spoken with Claire about whether or not she placed any bags in the overhead bin above the injured plaintiff's row on that flight?
No.
Have you ever spoken with Brandon about whether or not he placed any bags in the overhead bin above the injured passenger's row on that flight?
No.
Did you make any attempt to speak with any other passenger about what had happened on the flight?
I mean, I attempted to find who she said hit her with a bag, but people were deplaning, so nobody really wants to stop and talk to you.
Understandable. What specifically did you do to attempt to locate that passenger?
I asked who it was and where they were.
And you say, I asked, you're referring to the injured passenger?
Yes.
And I believe earlier you said that she told you she believed that person was already gone?
Yes.
So was that the end of your search?
For him, yes.
Okay.
I can't leave the plane, so.
Why is that?
because of the required minimum on board the plane. So the minimum flight attendants have to be on the plane at any point there is even one passenger on board.
Okay, so if I understand that correctly, you're not permitted to get off the plane until all the passengers are off, is that correct?
Yes.
If perhaps there's a flight that has more than the minimum required flight attendants, then it would be possible for a couple of them to leave as long as the minimum number was still on board?
Yes.
Okay. Do you know whether Claire or Brandon did any investigation as to, well, strike that. Do you know whether Claire or Brandon spoke to any of the other passengers about what had happened?
I don't know.
Do you know whether Claire or Brandon went to look for the particular passenger that may have pulled the bag out?
Not that I know of, but we were told he was gone. So.
Okay. During the time that you were with the injured passenger in or around her seat, was Claire with you the whole time?
I think Claire went to the back to make sure there was no ice left, but otherwise, yes.
Okay. And was Brandon there at any point while the passenger was still in or around her own seat?
I don't believe he was with us until after all the passengers were off, because one flight attendant has to be with the door, and that's his responsibility as the purser.
I think you said at some point you moved her up to the first class area. Is
Yes.
that right? Is that the area that Brandon was in?
Yes.
Okay. Was the injured passenger with anyone else?
Her husband.
Did you have any conversations with her husband about what had happened?
Yeah, all of us were talking together, so he was a part of the whole conversation.
Okay. Do you remember any specifics with respect to conversations with him?
No.
Do you recall speaking to him about whether he saw the incident occur?
Not that I remember details of, no.
Okay. Do you know whether the injured passenger's husband spoke to either Claire or Brandon about what had happened?
I don't know.
Are you certain that it was the injured passenger as opposed to her husband who told you the person that had pulled out the bag was already gone?
No, I'm not certain. I mean, he was there for the conversation, so
Okay.
I don't recall if she told me that or he told me that.
The bag that actually struck the passenger on the head was a separate bag from the one that was pulled out, right?
Objection.
Oh, is that your understanding?
You can answer. Okay. That's not what I was told originally.
Okay. Told by whom?
Her.
Okay, so you recall her telling you that the actual bag that was being yanked out was the one that hit her?
Yes.
Okay. And she told you that while she was still in or around her own seat?
Yes.
Did she describe the bag that hit her?
No.
Did her husband describe the bag that hit her?
Not that I remember.
Did her husband state that it was his understanding? Well, that's a bad question. Let me ask a different one. Was there any conversation with the husband about whether it was the bag that was pulled out by the other passenger being the bag that struck her in the head?